deep privilege today to have Dame Anne Salmond come to address us on the subject of Tupaya, and she'll explain exactly what Tupaya got up to. Joining her, I would like to welcome Dr. Eru Tarena, the Executive Director of Takona Teraki. It's a Ngāi Tahu-led collaborative, unleashing Māori potential. You've been described as a social innovator and a historian. And you're going to talk, I believe, in an armchair style with Dame Anne on voyaging and discovery. So, would you like to start by giving us a mihi, and then maybe Dame Anne can come up onto the stage. Eru.
Tihei uri uri, tihei nako nako, kātau hā whakatau ko te raki e tūnei. Kātau hā whakatau ko te papi raro nei. Kātau hā whakatau ko te mātuku mai I a rarotoma. Ko I aru ki hea manawa pau roto, ko I aru ki hea manawa pau waho. Whakatina kia tina te more I Hawaiki. E pupu ake ana, e wawau ake ana, te arewa tū ki te raki. Au e kia eke no haramai te toki, haumi e, hui e, tāiki. Ko te reo tuatahi, ko te mihi tuatahi, ki oku whanauka ka noho mai rā. Te marae, te kanohi o ōnuku marae. Koutou katoa, Ngāti Ira Kihu, Ngāti Karaweko, nei anō te mihi o tēnei mokopono te whānau horomana kia koutou. Kia tui o tātou heringa tāngata, tātou kia tātou no reira, kia oku whanauka, tēnā koutou, huri tai āwhi o tō tātou whare. Koutou katoa, e te kanohi o tēnei whenua tāhua o Akaroa, tēnā koutou, mo te koutou nā whakawhāri ki te reo o mihi, kia māo. Kia ora everybody, my name is Eru Tarena, and I've just got the pleasure of responding to the beautiful mihi from Mike. And just to give a little bit of context, on my grandmother's side, I am Ngāi Tahu from the Salmond whānau, from Tuahiwi, with links to Kokorarata or Port Levy, and it's my connection to our whanaunga here at our beautiful Ōnuku Marae. I've managed to bring my two kids because they know Ōnuku Marae has the best food. So I never have any trouble with dragging my kids to Ōnuku Marae, a bit harder with some of the others. On my grandfather's side, I'm from Bluff, Stirling, but also really our connections with Dame Anne are whānau. And that she interviewed my great-grandfather and my namesake Eru Tarena, and the media. And so that's our whānau connection here today. So mihi kia koutou katoa ngā whanaunga rikma, teia tiki tō tātou whare. I'm also involved a lot in waka. And so I've had the real pleasure of being part of Ngāti Wheke's welcome and celebration of the Tuia 250 activities which have been going on today. And Tā Tipene asked me to pass on his apologies that he's unable to attend. And I said, well, that's great, I can pass off all your killer one-liners as my own material, and no one will know the better. But really, partly what's been going on over the last couple of days has been Ngāi Tahu re-engaging, not just with waka culture, but with our Tahitian whanaunga. And Tā Tipene often describes Ngāi Tahu as being one of the youngest cultures and the oldest culture at the same time. And what he means by that is, we forget that yes, we've been in this landscape for 1,000 years, but in the scheme of things, we are the southernmost point, the last vestige of this Polynesian navigator culture. And it's easy for us to forget that all of our place names, our traditions, are the same as those in Hawaii, are the same as those in Rapa Nui or Easter Island in Tahiti. And so we are the last stop, really, of that extreme voyage with these tiny specks of land, but of a voyaging culture which crossed the biggest expanse of our planet, the Pacific Ocean, using only sun, star, wind, and clouds as navigation guides. The other part of that, and what he says is also most interesting about Ngāi Tahu, is that because we're the youngest, we've kept a lot of the oldest traditions. And when you think of things like Aorangi or Aoraki, which for us is everything, but Aorangi is in every island group in the Pacific. The difference being is with us is we still remember the tradition, whereas in other islands around the Pacific, it's a much older tradition that has dropped away from their memories. So it's just beautiful to reconnect Ngāi Tahu with our North Island whanaunga, and I do think of our ukoko a few years ago, Rick Toe used to always say, Ngāi Tahu, forget all we are just runaway North Islanders. And so the process of Tuia is reconnecting us with our North Island iwi, our North Island kin, and us as people of Paikea. But in particular too, the last couple of days and really the welcoming of our Tahitian crew from the Waka Whawhaiti onto Rāpaki Marae, it's been about Ngāi Tahu reconnecting with our deeper roots all the way back to Tahiti, Marquesas, Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and really beyond. Nā reira, ka tuia e ra whakaaro ki kone, e ngā tuku te rāpau kōrero ki tō tātou kahurangi, Damien Salmond, but just beautiful to think about the kaupapa of tuia, which has really been about binding us, and that's what that word means, ka tuia, binding us all together. And if you think of, at the time, tupaia was the one that was really the translator, the glue in between those first interactions between our two cultures. Nā reira, ka kāti aui konei, ka poto te kaka o te papa, and tuku te rāpau kōrero ki tō tātou kahurangi, Dame and Salmond. Kia ora tātou.
So really good. Ko te wai e horara. Ko te marae e takoto rā. Wenu. Ko koutou āku rangatira, ngā tangata whenua, Ngāi Tahu. Ki āku rangatira, Eru, koutou katoa, tēnā koutou, mihi mai, mihi mai, mihi mai. It's just fantastic to be here. I know that this is a time of anniversaries. So we had the anniversary of the arrival of Endeavour, 250 years ago, pretty much. We have the 50th anniversary of the Akaroa Civic Trust, and I think it's roughly 20 years since I was here when I was the chair of New Zealand Historic Places Trust and met with the trustees of the marae. And we were talking about the future of Akaroa, but also the future of the marae and that wonderful site. And so it's a huge privilege to be here, and to be here with Eru, because as he was saying, my mentor from the time that I was very young was his great-grandfather Eru Sterling, Whakatane Sterling, and his great-grandmother Media, after whom our own daughter is named. And from the time I was 17 or so, they became my guides into Te Ao Māori, and that relationship was a very close and deep one until they both died in the early 80s. So we're here today to talk about, as Eru said, somebody who's a binder, a joiner, a linker, tupaia. The High Priest Navigator, the Star Navigator, who sailed with James Cook and Joseph Banks. And we're going to talk together a little later on about that voyaging legacy and what's happening to it today. But I thought I'd start just by talking about tupaia himself. So tupaia, if we can have our next slide. Tupaia was a high priest from Raiatea originally, which is one of the major islands in the Society Island group. He was a high priest, he was a navigator, he was a scholar, an artist, a linguist, and a warrior. And as I spent quite a bit of time in Tahiti studying the early history of that contact period in the Society Islands with Cook and Bougainville and later on William Bligh, I realised just how incredibly important tupaia was in his own home society. So he was somebody that has almost been forgotten, actually, in the history of the Endeavour voyage that we're commemorating more or less as we speak. And he was almost forgotten also back in Tahiti and in Raiatea, as we've learned. But he piloted the Endeavour for James Cook through the Society Islands. He handled most of the negotiations with Māori during the Endeavour 6 months, circumnavigation of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And his presence on board the Endeavour meant that this was a voyage like no other. Of all the Pacific voyages of discovery from Europe, the ones where Europeans came and found various islands in the Pacific, including Aotearoa, the fact that they had a high priest navigator on board that ship and a scientific party from the Royal Society of New Zealand, of London, made it a very different kind of voyage. So I want to talk about that a little and tell you a little bit more about Tupaia before Eru and I start exploring the legacies and how they're shaping up. So, in this part of the country, and also on the East Coast and various other places, Māori saw so much of Tupaia. He could speak. He could speak to them and with them. They understood him. He was a man of huge mana in his own society, but also here. And many people thought that this was Tupaia, the Endeavour was Tupaia's ship. And you could understand that because he was the one that could speak. He could say what he liked about the people that he had bought, the vessel that he was on. And when Cook returned to Aotearoa on the second and third voyages, people came out, especially in the second voyage, and asked after Tupaia and wept when they learned that he had died in Tahiti. So who was he? Well, as I learned when I started spending time in Tahiti, he was a highborn ari'i from a ari'i family, a highborn chiefly family in Ra'iatea. He had estates and titles at various marae on Ra'iatea, but also on Huahine. And some of you may know these islands, you might have travelled there and visited these beautiful islands. And when he was young, he joined what's called the Arioi. And the Arioi were a kind of group of people who were dedicated to the god of war and fertility, the god of life and death, Oru, in the Society Islands at that time. And so each of the districts in the Society Islands had its own lodge. It's kind of like, not exactly like the Masons, but that was kind of like a lodge, and each of them had their head, who was called a blackleg arioi, for the tattoos, the very dense tattoos on their legs. And they wore red pari, their loincloth, and they were very, very distinguished and important people. And they would sit in state during the rituals that were held in the arioi lodges in the Society Islands. And Tupaia was a blackleg arioi. They couldn't have children because they had command or related to the god Oru, who was the god of fertility and war. And part of their tapu status was that they couldn't have children. They didn't have babies. And despite that, and you'll probably see it when you see the Tahitian dances today, the dances they perform are actually pretty mild compared with the ones that used to be performed in the early times of Tupaia. Intensely erotic, because they were calling out the powers of fertility that brought ora and flourishing and abundance to people, to plants, to animals, to the ocean. And many of them were dancers, some of them were musicians. There were people like actors and artists. They performed skits. They were tattooists. They made special kinds of bark cloth. They were very amusing. The skits were satirical often. And as Cook learned, when the Europeans came, they often performed these skits that were kind of parodies in a way of the European visitors. And they travelled, as they travelled around the islands. So here we switch to our next slide. They would travel in these amazing flotillas. So you can see the sort of waka that they were sailing in when they were on their ritual journeys. They're really spectacular vessels. They often had stages on them where the performers stood on this high stage on the deck of the waka and would dance, would sing, would chant. And whole fleets of these waka would go out and travel around the islands. And they would take in the seasonal rituals from island to island, decked with flowers, with feathers, with perfume bark cloth garments, and dancing on the platforms. So it was very spectacular, and as they travelled from island to island, they carried the gods with them. And the seasonal rituals that brought abundance, that brought fertility to land, sea, and people were carried out by these arioi. And as I say, Tupaia was a high, black-leg arioi, a very, very high-ranking tohunga, if you like, tahua, but he was also a navigator, whaatere. So sometimes the rituals that they carried out were somber and frightening, and that was when they were, Oro was the god of war, and other times they were joyous, and they were about abundance of fertility, and that was when they were celebrating Oro as the god of fertility. So Tupaia was brought up in this particular movement, if you like, the arioi. He became a celebrated navigator. He was brought up on Raiatea, and the key marae on Raiatea is Taputapuatea. Very famous marae still today. It's still there. You could go and see it. It looks different today because the trees mostly have been chopped down. Marae used to be quite dark places because this is where you went into the realm of the ancestors, the core. And you went into that space and you were in direct contact with the ancestors. Taputapuatea means sacred atea. Today on the marae atea is the place where you stand and speak. Back in Tahiti it was the place where you spoke with the atua, with the gods. And he was a genius. He was a Tupaia was an incredibly clever person, regarded by the Europeans but also by his own people. They say he was the most intelligent man in the islands. Gail Forster called him a genius. And this marae, Taputapuatea, which you can still visit today, was the hub of the arioi movement. And so the waka would sail from there. They came from Taputapuatea down here to New Zealand, to Aotearoa. They went up to Hawaii. So there's a couple kapuakea up there. There's Taputapuatea, one in Whitianga. There's Paul Tapsel's elders say that Mokoia Island in the middle of Lake Rotorua used to be called Taputapuatea. Joe Williams, Chief Judge now, a High Court judge, but used to be the Chief Judge of the Māori Land Court at one point, tells me there were many Taputapuatea that he's seen referred to in tribal traditions around the country. So these were people that carried their atua, their gods, to new islands. And they were navigators who sailed under the power of their ancestors. The winds, the birds, the stars, the ocean itself, the fish, the whales, they were all ancestors, and they sailed with the power of their ancestors to these far-flung places. And they kept these linkages going after the original, settlement in a new island. There would be return voyages because people wanted to go back to Taputapuatea and to keep their links with the home islands going. And there were still memories. In 1823, for example, when John Williams, the missionary, landed in the Cooks, they were asking after a drum that they had sent to Taputapuatea, and there'd been a famous conflict in which the high priests from this part of the world, this part of the Pacific Ocean, which they called they called the Aotea, the realm of light, probably the original element of Aotearoa, actually. Might have come from those old names, the old names from this part of the Pacific in the Society Islands. And there'd been a conflict, and the high priest from this part of the Pacific had been killed. And memories of that were still alive in 1823, and even more recently still, here in Aotearoa. So how does Tupaia come into this history? Well, in about 1760, so about 9 years before Cook arrives in Tahiti for the very first time, warriors from Bora Bora, and many of you will know that, it's a very famous kind of tourist spot these days, full of hotels, but in those days it was full of very feisty and powerful warriors. They invaded Raiatea, and they killed the high chief of the island, and they threw down the stones of Taputapuatea. They desecrated the marae. And Tupaia was, by that stage, had graduated, if you like, as a high priest of that marae. And he fought in the battle. He was badly wounded in the battle. But then he was sent, when he recovered, to take the images of Oro, the god, and the red feather girdle, which was the insignia of the high chiefs of the island, to a place of safety in Tahiti, away from Raiatea. And the young high chief, the descendant, the heir of his father who'd been killed, was smuggled out as well and also taken to Tahiti. So Tupaia was very involved in some major events in his own home island before he joined the Endeavour. He came to Tahiti, he forged a very close relationship with the high chieftainess, a woman called Pūrea at Papara, and became her lover as well as her high priest, and helped her, or tried to help her, to set up her son as the high chief of the whole island. And just before the Endeavour arrived, there was a war because the other chiefly leaders of the other districts didn't appreciate the ambition that had been expressed by Pūrea for his son. And they were in the process, when the Endeavour arrived, of building this enormous marae, which still stands. Oh, hang on, put it up. I've got it on my computer, but next one too. Yeah, this is it still stands. It's a kind of ruin now in Tahiti. When I first used to go there, it was covered with rubbish. I couldn't believe it. It was one of the most sacred sites on the island. But now they're restoring it, and people are treating it with the reverence it used to deserve. So this is Mahaiatea, which was the largest stone temple in the Society Islands to express the mana of this young high chief that Tupaia and his lover Pūrea were trying to establish as the high chief of the whole island. And so, while they were sort of building this marae, first of all the Dolphin arrived, Captain Wallace, the very first European ship to arrive in Tahiti, a British vessel with Captain Wallace from the Royal Navy, the Dolphin, turned up. There were conflicts with the local people, there were clashes, but in the aftermath, Wallace forged a bond relationship with Pūrea, this high chieftainess, and Tupaia, as her high priest, came on board the Dolphin. And this relationship was forged between Tupaia, who had been in the process of building this extraordinarily large and impressive marae for setting up this young high chief, and the British. Well, the Dolphin sailed away, and afterwards, again, there was this this was the point at which the other high chiefs said, we're not going to have this ambition, this kind of whakahihi, ambitious person trying to take over the whole of the island. And so they combined, the various other chiefs from the other regions combined, and they attacked Papara, and they routed the army of Amo and Tupaia. And that was what the state of affairs was when James Cook arrived towards the end of 1768. So they threw down this particular platform, they decimated the marae, as was the way. They killed a lot of the Papara people, and at the time when Cook arrived, Tupaia had been defeated, Amo had been defeated, Pūrea had been defeated, the marae had been wrecked, there were bones on the beaches. And so, anyway, along came James Cook on board the Endeavour, into the middle of all of that. And as you can see, Tupaia is a really important key player in Society Island politics at that time, but also across Polynesia because he was a voyager. He'd been to the Australs, he'd been to Tonga, he was a very experienced sailor, he was a brilliant linguist who could master the other dialects and speak to people in these other countries. And he was fascinated in particular by Joseph Banks, who was the young naturalist who headed up the Royal Society party on board the Endeavour. And Banks at this stage was in his 20s. He was elegant, he was full of the joy of life, you might say. He had a marvellous time in Tahiti, he had various love affairs, joined the Arioi, some of the ceremonies and the rituals, and he forged a bond friendship with Tupaia. I think it was because Tupaia and this patron, if you like, Pūrea, this very high chieftainess, had already forged a bond friendship with Captain Wallace and the British. So there was this link between the British, forged under ritual situations, that was then transferred to Tupaia and Joseph Banks. And you can't really understand what happened in that relationship without knowing something of that history, actually. Because the knowledge that Tupaia had, like any tohunga, like any tahua, was quite sacred, tapu. It couldn't be handed over just to anybody. And that was true of the knowledge of navigation and of tribal histories and genealogies. And Tupaia was fascinated because he was an artist. I think he was a tattooist. We don't know that for certain sure, but Joseph Banks got a tattoo, and so did Parkinson. And very likely they were given that tattoo by Tupaia. But in any case, he was already an artist, and he forged a really close relationship with the artists on board Endeavour, Sydney Parkinson and Herman Goring. This is a sketch by Tupaia. But as we'll see, it looks like he actually sat next to these artists on many occasions and they sketched the same subject. So there's a scoring sketch of the chief mourner's costume. This is the chief mourner and the great tangi that they had, the great mourning rituals. Joseph Banks actually participated in one of those, and this is the costume of the chief mourner, as sketched by Scoring and was sketched by Tupaia. And I'd love to know the colours in these sketches, whether they are actually Tahitian dyes or whether they're watercolours. But certainly those artists work closely together. And you can see this in the next sketches as well, the Arioi Longhouse by Scoring, and a similar sort of image by Tupaia. And all these images that Tupaia created were focused on Arioi life of various kinds. There was the chief mourner's costume, there was sketches of marae, there were dancers, there were musicians, and so on. He also took them through all the rituals of an Arioi voyage. So as they arrived at each place, they went to the marae, he met up with the high priests of that place, and carried out the rituals of encounter. So, in a way, the Endeavour voyage became an Arioi voyage, certainly through the Society Islands, which is really quite fascinating. And then, as they headed away from the Society Islands, Tupaia tried to get Cook to sail west. He wanted to go back to Tonga. He told Cook there were islands over there, and Cook had orders, though, to come south, because he had orders, apart from observing the transit of Venus in Tahiti, he had secret orders to come down south and search for Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern continent. And so Cook followed his orders, as he had to, as a Royal Naval Commander, and headed south instead. But just before they took off from the Society Islands, Tupaia persuaded Cook, took the Endeavour through the sacred pass of Takutapuatea. So, can we go back one? Where are we? Yeah, what's Takutapuatea? Back. So I have this back one, back two. Yeah, here we are. So this is Takutapuatea Marae, sketched by Parkinson. Tupaia took them there, came through the sacred pass, which is the way in which all the Arioi voyages would have to go, took them through the rituals on that marae, and then took them to his own home bay, Hamanino Harbour, where the local Arioi entertained them. He had hoped that Cook would help him drive the Bora Bora warriors out of Vatiatea. Cook would not do this. He didn't offer himself as an ally to Tupaia, and so Tupaia had to just manage as best he could. I think Tupaia was keen to get muskets, but he was keen to get the military support of the British in reclaiming his own home island, as you can well imagine. So instead of going west, as Tupaia wanted, then Cook started heading south. And they went to Rurutu, in the Australs, which Tupaia said he had visited many years before. And he started working on these charts. So here's a chart of the Society Islands. We think this was sketched by Tupaia, but all the names around the coastline are written in Joseph Banks's handwriting. And you can see this little sketches of mountains and a big mountain there. So what Tupaia was doing was trying to pass on some of his knowledge of his own home islands to Joseph Banks and also to Cook. And this is all part of the navigational process of exchange of knowledge that started to happen as he piloted the ship through the islands. And you can see that Cook had great confidence in his skill as a sailor. And as they headed south away from places that, it doesn't look as though Tupaia knew about Aotearoa. Some people have said that he did. At the moment, it doesn't look like it, because he told Cook he didn't know of any large lands to the south. And in the island lists that he started to dictate to Cook, and to Molyneux, who was the ship's master, and to Richard Pepperskill, who was one of the officers, he gave these long lists of islands. And this was the way in which that knowledge was passed on in the old days. You'd recite the name of the island, with the name of the high chief, with the main characteristics of the people, with the main produce from that place, and the sailing directions. But all the Europeans managed to capture out of that was basically the names of the islands and their bearings from Tahiti. And because they navigated by the stars, but the constellations in Tahitian astronomy are different from the ones that the Europeans knew, and also like the command that Tupaia had of English and the Europeans had of Tahitian just wasn't adequate to communicate. It was like, someone that's very new to a language trying to study physics in that language. I think it just wasn't possible to communicate all the things that Tupaia knew about these islands. But he did his best, and the outcome of that was this amazing chart, which is still being debated. Lots of people are writing about it. Scholars from Germany just recently have written a very, very large tome about it, trying to understand just how this chart of the islands around Tahiti works. In the island list, Tupaia described 130 islands altogether. There's 70 on this chart. And what we do know is that it was an attempt by Tupaia, in collaboration with the Europeans, to understand something about the knowledge of his own people of the Pacific Ocean. And we do know that from all the scholarship that's been carried out, that the expanse of this chart is enormous. And it covers a very, very wide range of islands, right across the Pacific from east to west, and a pretty good span from north to south. It didn't seem to include Hawaii and didn't seem to include Aotearoa. So, now we're coming down to Aotearoa, to New Zealand, and by this time, James Cook had come to conclusions about the capability of these navigators. And it's so fascinating that James Cook in 1769 had kind of worked out for himself just the extent of their capacity. He says, in these pahi, which are the local craft, these people sail on those seas from islands to islands for several hundred leagues, the sun serving them for a compass by day, and the moon and the stars by night. When it comes to be proved, we shall no longer be at a loss to know how the islands lying in those seas came to be peopled. For if the inhabitants of Raiatea have been at islands laying 200 or 300 leagues to the westward of them, it cannot be doubted that the inhabitants of all those western islands may have been at others as westward of them, and so we may have them from island to island quite to the East Indies. And this is quite amazing because pretty much after all the work that's been happening in the last, say, 30 years of lithic sourcing, of DNA lineages for people, but also for the animals and plants that travelled with the Polynesian voyages, this is pretty much the story that everybody has come up with, that the Pacific was peopled originally, explored and discovered by the ancestors of people like Tupaia, from island to island, from the East Indies, all the way across to Rapa Nui to Easter Island, all the way north to Hawaii and all the way south down here to Aotearoa. And so Cook, having worked so closely with Tupaia, came to this conclusion in 1769. And yet, for a very long period, especially from about, I suppose, the 1800s onwards, and certainly into quite recent historic times. Scholars have argued that it wasn't possible for these people to purposefully explore and navigate the South Seas. They just thought it wouldn't be technically or intellectually possible for people who were not Europeans to perform these feats of navigation. And yet Cook in 1769 had no doubt about how the Pacific had been first explored and settled. So it's kind of ironic at the moment we're having these debates about, what did Cook claim to have discovered the islands of the Pacific? Well, no, Cook didn't. People since then have claimed that on Cook's behalf, but Cook himself was in no doubt about where the navigation expertise and skills lay that led to the first exploration and settling of these places right across the Pacific. So as we come to Aotearoa, I'll just be brief and then we can talk about this in question time perhaps. We can talk about the arrival here in New Zealand and Tupaia's role as they travelled around the countries, the coastline of Aotearoa for 6 months. It was a very long circumnavigation. And as we know, cartographically, very impressive, the kind of charts that were produced. But to have a high priest navigator on board who could speak with the local people and who was somebody that they recognised as being somebody of an extraordinary mana was transformative. There's no doubt about that. And so we've had a lot of debate recently in New Zealand. I'm from Gisborne, from Turanganuiakiwa, and we've had some very feisty debates about the events of in October 1769 when the Endeavour came ashore and the crew came ashore. And the fact is that it doesn't seem as though Tupaia came ashore on the first day. I think it was because Banks in particular, Cook was more sceptical, but Banks in particular, when they first sighted land in Aotearoa, he was totally convinced that they had discovered Terra Australis incognita. He thought this was the southern continent. I don't think he really linked it in his mind with the other islands in the Pacific. And so I think that they didn't imagine that Tupaia would be much use when they went ashore on that first day. And so it seems that he stayed on board the ship. And as we all know now, I mean, the story is well known and it's been much traversed in the media and much debated at home, and we've had all sorts of discussions about it in the last few months. As they came ashore, local people were astounded when they first saw the Endeavour. They thought it was a floating island, perhaps. Maybe it was a great bird, a bird of Ruakapanga. They first brought the kumara from Hawaii. There had been a prophecy at Mahia, and the flotilla are going to end their voyage in Mahia next weekend. The flotilla that's sailing around, and we saw the spirit out there. And of course, Eru will talk about the voyaging that's been happening just in the last few months when we talked together. And this priest at Mahia had prophesied, Tifa tifa te pō, ko te pākere whā, ko arihirangi tēnei rā e haere nei. Dark, dark is the night, as the red and white strangers, the high chief of the sky is arriving. And when they came ashore, of course, the Marines had red jackets. I guess they probably looked pretty pink and white to the local people. And Tupaia wasn't there to act as a mediator. And what happened was that Cook and Banks, with a party of Marines and some of the officers, landed on the east bank of the Turangarui River, right where the port is today. Banks and Dr. Salmond were gasping to collect plants because they thought that they had arrived at Terra Australis incognita. It was like a moonshot. There they were in this amazing place. They were botanists, natural historians. So they went across the river and went to a fishing camp and started collecting plants. And while that was happening, they left 4 boys in charge of the yawl, which was the small boat. Then 4 warriors came down from Titirangi, which is Kaiti Hill. Used to be the courting hill when I was young. And they had very long spears, according to the Europeans. And I think what was going on there was a challenge. because there were 4 boys, 4 warriors. If it had been an attack, there would have been many more. There were many more people around. And the coxswain, who was guarding the pinnace, which was the larger boat, saw one of these warriors pull back his spear, getting ready to throw it at the boys, who had, terrified, run back to the yawl and were frantically trying to row it back out up the river out to sea. And he fired a warning shot overhead with a musket, another one with a musketoon. These men had never seen or heard anything like muskets before, of course. Wouldn't have known what a warning shot was even. And when he began the throw, the challenger, who we now know was called Te Maro, of Te Aitanga Hawiti or Oneone, was shot dead through the heart and then lay dead there on the beach. And this set the whole tone for what happened in the next couple of days. So Tupai wasn't there, and we can only speculate what would have happened if he had been there, because he could have called out in Tahitian. He was able, as we discovered the next day, to speak with Māori and make himself understood. So they went back to the ship, very distressed. They had orders, Cook had given his men not to shoot unless they were absolutely endangered. And he also had orders from the Earl of Morton, who was the president of the Royal Society of London, that these people had the right to defend their territories. They were the legal possessors of their lands. Even if they resisted violently, the Earl of Morton said, you should resist, control your men, and try not to harm them. But Cook was on the other side of the river, the coxswain was there, challenge was underway. No doubt they thought that the young boys were about to be speared, and so it unfolded in that kind of way. So the next day, just to speak briefly about this, and this will give you an idea of the power of Tupaia. The next day, when they landed ashore on the same side, the eastern side of the Turanganui River where the port is, with a party of Marines wearing scarlet jackets, which was the tapu colour in Tahiti as well as in Aotearoa. Warriors drew up on the opposite bank of the Turanganui River, about 150 of them, and performed an impassioned haka. And they reproached the British for the shooting. And they called out, absolutely, because of course they didn't really know what had happened. Never seen guns before, never seen anyone killed by projectile firearms. And it turned out that Tupaia could understand what they were saying, so he started calling back to them and saying, look, we just want food, we want fresh water, we don't want to fight. Come over and meet with us. And eventually one of these people put down their weapons, one of the warriors put down his weapons, swam across the river, stood on Te Tokapeo, which just happens to be one of the most important tribal markers within a couple of 100 kilometres actually on that coast. Still very important, although it got blown up by the harbour board in the 1880s. And he stood there, Cook put down his musket, signalled to him, they met, they hungied. There was this moment of amity in the middle of the chaos. Then others came across the river, but they had their weapons with them, sort of tied to their legs. They started trying to exchange weapons with the Europeans, snatching at their weapons. The Europeans started to feel at risk, especially Joseph Banks, as it turns out, and they fired. And again, Te Rako was shot, and a couple of other warriors were wounded, certainly in the legs. So, the fact that Tupaia didn't come ashore on that first day, it meant that people were already horrified, basically. What on earth are these beings? Where have they come from? How do they have these powers to kill people at a distance? They're enemies. They've come in war. They haven't come in peace. And so there it was. And then the next day, as we all know, later on that day, Cook decided that he would try and take some people on board and treat them kindly, because he had orders to make friends, and he needed fresh food and water. They'd been at sea for quite a while. And these fishing canoes came back from the ocean, and these are relatively small craft, and they decided they would take the boats and try and intercept a couple of them, and one of them just took off. They took their paddles and they outstripped the European craft. And the other one was intercepted. And again, the crew just resisted with everything. They threw fish, they threw anchor stones, they used their paddles as weapons, started fighting back. And I think Cook lost control of that situation, actually. And there were shootings. And in that particular situation, it was very, very difficult. Cook did not excuse himself. Joseph Banks did not excuse himself that night. Banks wrote in his journal, "This is the worst day my life has yet seen. Black be the mark for it. Heaven send that such men may never return to a bitter future reflection." But of course, Rolf Carter had never forgotten, any more than Hauiti and Oneone had forgotten the shootings. So let me just stop at that point and just say very briefly that for the rest of the time around the New Zealand, the Aotearoa coastline, Tupaia acted as a mediator. He went ashore at Uawa, Tolega Bay. I just flicked through a few slides at the model. We think this image of the model who died, the first man that was shot. Next slide is some hoia, these beautiful panels that were offered, we think, to Tupaia to try and persuade him to come back ashore when the Endeavour was becalmed off Young Nick's head. A number of these have been returned to Turanga in the last month or so by the British Museum and also by the Pitt Rivers and the Cambridge Museums. Then they went to Tolega Bay, Uawa, where the sketch, very famous sketch of Tupaia, by Tupaia, Joseph Banks, it turns out, exchanging bark cloth with a local man for quite a big crayfish. They talk a lot about the crayfish there, the koda. And he talked to the high priest in that place and forged a relationship with them. Again, there were these schools of learning, like the ones back at home in Tahiti. And Tupaia was able to sit in a cave there, you can still see the cave, and have these wānanga with this high priest. And so this was a peaceful encounter, and the people at Uawa welcomed the flotilla when it came, including the Endeavour, because it had been a peaceful encounter. And then they travelled, and oh yes, these carvings were presented. We think maybe to Tupaia, this particular carving here, it ended up in Germany, was restored there, and it's also just been returned from Germany to Tolega Bay. And thereby hangs another whole tale. They were chased by double canoes, can't run away. They outstripped, these are, waka could sail really fast, and you can see the new ones, the ones that we are seeing today out for the Endeavour, they sail at a real clip. When we were looking at the flotilla in the bay at Turanganui, those waka were just streaking past the Endeavour. They sailed really quickly. And this one, they actually pelted stones at the windows of the great cabin, smashed some of them. And I guess they came down to the south, of course. They spent time in Queen Charlotte Sounds. And Tupaia there again forged relationships with the high priest and the high chiefs of Queen Charlotte Sounds. Talked to them, talked about geographical knowledge, talked about the stories of their ancestors and the voyages that had happened before. And when the Endeavour came back, when the Resolution Cook came back to Queen Charlotte Sounds in the second voyage, next image, people came out in the waka and they all called for Tupaia. And when they were told that he had died in Batavia, because as we now know, he never got home to Tahiti, he didn't manage to get to see King George, never got his muskets to drive out the Bora Bora warriors. He died probably of dysentery or malaria in Batavia. And when people were told that in Aotearoa, they wept, they composed songs, they sang for Tupaia. So it's a sad story in lots of ways, but a really important one, because what's happening right now, and Eru and I can talk about this, and maybe Eru, it might be a great time to come up and we can just sort of yarn about what's actually happening right now. Because Eru, the reason I really wanted Eru to be here is not just because of the very close relationship that I had with his wonderful great-grandparents, but also because he's a voyager. So he's travelled, he's been on these voyaging canoes, some more. Hopefully I'll ask him some more about this and he can tell us and describe some of his experiences. So I thought it should get real at this point and hand over from the historian to the sailor.
All throughout our traditions, and even here, the stories of Waitaha are really prominent. But the key ancestor is Rākaihotu. His name means to navigate by the sun. And it's always something people forget. Navigating by the stars is good at night time, but you don't do nothing during the day. You navigate by the sun, and all of the figures in those traditions are constellations. The places that he learns at Tautare Nui o Matariki, they're all star names and star paths. So often when we sing, we don't even know we're reciting star paths, we're reciting instructions, we're reciting constellations that are associated with seasons that are good for voyaging. And so it's all encoded, a bit like the Da Vinci Code, I guess. It's in our stories, it's in our whakapapa, and partly the process we have to do is to reclaim and remember that stuff that has always been there. And we've been really fortunate where I think with ones like Hoturo Kerr, who learned from Mo Pialuk, the Satawal Caroline Islands navigator, who probably from about the 1970s. And that's one thing you see with voyaging, it's the spirit of generosity, where he taught the Hawaiians. The Hawaiians taught people as well, like Sehikta Busby, Piki Nukumai Busby, Hoturo Kerr from Tainui, and so we've been able, through the generosity of our North Island whānau, to re-engage and to be part of that voyaging renaissance and to start to go on some of those voyages. So we've been really lucky that we've had a large cohort of maitahu. We've run our own sailing trips and expeditions, but also have been part of a national Māori Pacific. And it's been really phenomenal because it's when you go to these places, and as I said, Aora, they're always together, and they're all in, so we have Muri Hiku here, Muri Whenua, Waianae, all of our place names are all the same. Our traditions are all the same. And even listening to our Tahitian orators yesterday at Rapaki Marae, they were easy to understand, and some of our Māori orators. the dialects for here are just so similar. And so you start to understand that even though we've been separated by time and distance, it's also been that distance that has almost trapped us, where our culture, and particularly if you look at a lot of the islands like Samoa, we're closer to Rapa Nui, to Tahiti and Hawaii than we are to Samoa or Tonga or Fiji, and they were all interacting. And so I suppose the speed of their evolution in terms of language and culture was moving at a faster pace. We're the most isolated parts of the Pacific, even though we're the most geographically dispersed, are the parts that are the most culturally the same. That we can talk to people from Rapa Nui, Tahiti and Hawaii in basically the same language. And so part of that voyaging has been reminding us that it's not Māori and Pacifica who are something else. It's actually going, well, where do you think we come from? Who are we? And again, part of that voyaging process, you'd be sailing around Samoa and go, oh, you guys all know Manono, it's in your Manono, which is like Eden, it's one of the highest heavens. Yes, that's it on the left. If you think of Paua Tūnetari Tikau, the great tohunga from the Banks Peninsula, and in our cosmology from this area, the greatest edge of the world, this rim, is called Piko Piko Whiti. And then we go, oh, you heard of Piko Piko Whiti? We go, oh yes, that's and the heavens up there. They go, oh yeah, that's over here on the right. So you start to understand that voyaging map just was brought here in the suitcase and unpacked, and that became our cosmology, that became our sacred traditions. And so what we think of as something that is heavenly is is also something that is real and something that's quite profane for our Pacific cousins who might, climb up the back of Aorangi to go visit their taro hatch, on a daily basis. And I think that's something that when you think of the process of the discovery of Cook was transformational for Māori. It reintegrated us to the rest of the world. The voyaging is kind of transformational as well because it's reintegrating us to who we are, and to remembering that we weren't born here, we came here, and that whakapapa, that reo, that connects us and binds us through the Pacific. And then I think too, when you look at navigators and then you look at Cook, that there's they're the same types of people. That there is a respect for the ocean, respect for the elements, and I think when you have a navigator, regardless of what culture, they speak the same language and they have the same temperament. And I think that's been interesting too. To go some of the trickier parts of navigating those first arrivals are different when viewed from the water, when viewed from a voyaging culture.
And so Moses apparently sat there. Said, okay, all right, I told you. And he sat there and they sailed on the course that the escort yacht had dictated into the middle of more or less a tornado. And Jack, who's not an emotional character, you'll know him, he's a very staunch guy. He said he was absolutely terrified. And he was out there, they were being thrown almost over all the time by the waves. They were just about being tipped. And he said he just, at one point, looked up and he saw Mo sitting there by the cabin, and his eyes were completely calm. And he said, okay, right, and he picked himself up and was able to, start helping with the craft of getting out of that storm at Mo's direction. But, and he says that Mo used to say things like, when the weather's like this, don't pray for good weather, pray for courage. And in some of the debates we've had over 2 or 250, Hotu and Jack have been quoting Mo Peel quite a bit, saying things like, don't pray for good weather, pray for courage. And when it gets really rough, really rough, that's when you can see the caliber of the people. That kind of thing. So you must have seen this when you've been out, because you've been voyaging yourself.
Yeah, I think one of the worst voyages I've had has just been local. And I'm Honui and sailing down from Nelson and going past Kokoda, and I spent a lot of time growing up around Kokoda. And, you sort of have that Maui vision that I'll be tanned and muscular down the back, and the sun's blazing, and we'll stop off and say hello to all of our whānau. We had the 60-knot winds, and I was throwing up over the side for about 3 days. So the romance and what you imagine. And my first trip was, I just stalked Hotu and met him, bumped into him somewhere, and said, "I need to do all the voyaging stuff." And well, can I come? And if you tell me when, I'll fly up. And he was taking a group of their rangatahi, and so I jumped on, and again, same thing, had the vision of being Maui and wind blowing through my hair, and in the first 5 minutes I was staring at the horizon going, oh no, I've got 2 weeks of this. But you just adjust. And I think that's one of the things that they've been really big on is just having trust and faith. And when you look at that dominant story, when you boil it down, I think the narrative that has been around and embedded and ingrained in one, these crazy fishermen that just by chance were caught in a storm and blown to New Zealand. And I can't remember the name of the painting, but I've been to the Louvre, and there was a foreign painting and everyone's sort of on boats. I think it's maybe Norse. I can't remember the name of the painting, very famous, but they're all sort of shriveled and starving refugees, and that became a template for paintings of Māori arrival. They're in double hull war canoes. Well, you don't sail a war canoe between islands, and they're all shriveled, and so even with our own whānau, take rangatahi from our own iwi. And people will be like, oh, you're going to be fit when you come back. It's like, well, actually, you're going to be eating rice and tuna, you know, for probably 3 or 4 weeks. And every now and then pulling a rope, and that's about the only activity they're going to have. They're not going to be skinny and fit, but they're going to be chilling out and learning lots. And some of those ideas that we think of, the narrative, which was, you know, Polynesians could never have been able to compute 2,000 constellations and you know, where they are on the horizon at sunrise and where they are on the horizon at sunset. That's what a navigator has to do. You know, the cognitive skills, you know, the leap of that is just phenomenal. And yeah, that was the narrative, that was part of our undoing. You know, it placed us and positioned us as yeah, like refugees that were here by chance. You know, we had no logic for, or did anyone pack 6 weeks worth of food, water, some kumara, the odd pig, and you know, when you go on a fishing trip, you know, it's ridiculous. But again, part of that navigation has been the challenge of overthrowing that dominant narrative, which is, yeah, we were here by chance versus we were, you know, part of, you know, the astronauts of their time, where those voyages were making, traversing distances at a time when the Greeks weren't sailing beyond the sight of land. Yeah, and that shifts that whole narrative, and particularly for our kids, you know, from being refugees, starving, you know, by chance, and then suddenly going, well, you come from, your DNA is, you know, from the greatest explorers that ever lived. You know, and that's part of our heritage. And again, for Maitahu, it's in our DNA, it's in our traditions, our place names, our stories. We just have to remember. And I think what's been key with Maipila and all of those navigators is that they've reminded us the importance of trusting ourselves and trusting our ancestral wisdom. That, you know, they talk a lot around with Maipila, yeah, seeing the island. You know, and I think that's kind of the key part for a voyager, that they discovered places no one knew existed. And it takes a hell of a lot of skill and courage, but also they were smart, that they always sailed into the wind. And, you know, if you do one thing, if you sail into the wind and nothing's there, then what happens? You turn around and poof it home. Yeah, they weren't reckless. Yeah, they were clever. And as I said, just those simple things of the whakahuruhu mana, you know, the bird migrations, whale migrations, when you're attuned to that, you know, there's all sorts of signals and data that's flowing around. And even just that simple thing of in the ocean, it's actually really, well, I mean, imagine there are lots of sailors here, but you know, when you're between islands, it's quite a boring place. Yeah, there's not a lot of fish, there's nothing going on. So once you start to see those patterns of swells, you know, of bird life, of fish, of turtles, there are all sorts of signals before you can even see land. And I think that's the key thing that's called wayfinding, you know, which is part navigation and part of it is, you know, that last 10% of your journey, understanding and being able to read all those signals to hone in on land. So it's not based around precision or predetermining where you are. It's just being really clear, well, where's our intent, where are we wanting to get to, and being open to those signals to tell you, well, when we're getting closer and how do we wayfind our way to that destination. I think that's something that's both cultural, both scientific, and part magical as well.
So you're talking about, you know, I remember talking to Michael Walker, Rangi's son, who's a marine biologist, and a very fine one. He'd done a lot of work on navigational systems of migrating birds, but also whales. And he found magnetite, which responds to geomagnetic patterns of the Earth's surface in the beaks of these migrating birds, but also in whales. And you know, like I said, the whales just go down the Kermadec Trench, and in the days when there were so many of them, it must have been like State Highway 2, you know, just see these, and they're much bigger than birds. So you see all these whales heading off and knowing that they're going to go and breed in the bay somewhere. the chances are. So the stories about Paikea, the ancestor, the whale ancestor, it's one of the things that I found fascinating over the last 20 or 30 years is just staggered shore starving. They're talking now about quite big purposeful migrations based on the DNA evidence and talking, multiple waka, quite a few of them. So it wasn't just one waka that turned up or a few in the storm. It was obviously purposeful. And just seeing the scientists, for example, things like I had the privilege of being on the Air New Zealand Sustainability Panel, and they were telling us this big top secret thing about in order to stop consuming so much fuel, they're going to do the scallop skin on the aircraft because it's aerodynamically incredibly efficient. And I kind of laughed and said, well, actually, they worked that out on the Voyager canoes because that's what they did do. They had these scallops on the hulls. So I've had friends who are yacht designers, and they say that these hulls are extraordinarily efficient. And the way in which the scallop works in the sea is also very, very efficient. So they're very, very fast. And if you look at the catamarans we used to win the America's Cup, and you put up one of these early Micronesian sailing vessels alongside it, you can see where the idea came from. We're still exploring this legacy of yacht design. So it has been fascinating just seeing the scientists, but the point I'm making before about Cook, in 1769, he got it because he sailed the Tupaia. And they talked and they kind of tried to understand each other's system of navigation. I'm sure that the journal I'd love to have is Tupaias, of course. The things that he must have been so fascinated in. He would have been soaking it all up as well. And that's what you see on the Tuia flotilla, too, actually. There's people like Hutu and Jack, as the leaders of that flotilla. They're basically saying about the Endeavour and the others, when various other people on shore have been jumping up and down about the Endeavour. They're saying, well, look, we're all sailors. We're all really interested in each other's craft. We're all men of the sea, we're women of the sea. And there was a kind of fellow feeling there, which meant that they said, we want to sail together. So it's been really interesting to see how the dynamic out in the ocean, as you say, is kind of different from the dynamic on shore sometimes.
I think too, even when you look at with NATO, we've been intermarrying since the 1820s. And those first arrivals were firstly scientists, and then whalers and sealers. And yes, there have been a few problems, sometimes with the sealers. And again, it's just that lost in translation. What was valuable for the sealers was the skin. What was valuable for our people was the meat. And sometimes that got lost in translation when we were cooking the meat and throwing the seal skins on the fire, which would cause all sorts of ruckus. But again, those first layers of interaction and partnership and intermarriage, everything was good. There weren't the histories of conflict that our peoples had. And so I think it's just remembering it wasn't until much later, actually even after the signing of the treaty, when you have the establishment of the colonial settler state, that you have everything going wrong. And I think that's one of the things probably Tipene kind of reminds everyone that the partnership is between Māori and Pākehā, not just between the Crown, and that the initial partnership as peoples was mutually beneficial, but it wasn't until you have the establishment of the state that the fortunes changed for our people for a long time.
Actually, I've never thought about that before, Edu, and I think that's actually a really deep insight. Up until 1840, nearly everybody that came, they were all sea people, basically. I mean, they were sailors, people that came. There weren't too many land-based people that turned up until the New Zealand Company started putting a whole lot of people on ships and bringing them out en masse. And that didn't really happen until 1840, as we know. So, and there's always been this kind of paradox of that early period in which people, as you say, they intermarried, people Māori joined vessels, and I find logs of them 1806 in Rio de Janeiro, and they're running around all over the place, meeting with royalty and just hopping on board vessels and checking the world out, basically. And Europeans arriving here in rather small numbers, but yeah, they were sea people. And it did seem to be not until really it was the settlers that came and wanted the land. And that was when the treaty partnership had to be negotiated all of a sudden, because the New Zealand company was coming with boatloads of people in. So I think we probably ought to wind up our discussion. Mr. Chair, we're looking at the time and thinking that maybe there's questions and things like that, but you guide us, because I think we've come to the... So, questions from the floor, or how are we doing for time? I think perhaps we're just about running through.
Well, we've got a roving mic here. If anyone's got a question, just put your hand up and I'll bring you a mic.
Oh, I've just got a very simple question. Do you know how old Tupaia was when Cook and the Endeavour were alive?
No birth certificates. You know, the Endeavour was mainly, most of the people on board the Endeavour were young. I mean, Cook was quite elderly compared with, Banks was in his 20s, and a lot of the boys that were involved in that initial Picard were probably 11, 12, 13. Ship's boys were really young. So a lot of the crew were young, but I think Tupaia was probably around about in his 40s, something like that. But he was certainly mature, he was already a major figure in Tahitian society. So he was probably around about this, and he was a tall guy. And that was the other thing. Banks and Cook were both tall. And in Tahiti, the rangatira, the Ari'i were very tall, 6'2", 6'3". It was one of the characteristics of the high chiefs, is that they were really statuesque, tall people. And I think that actually had a big impact. Williams Bligh, when he turned up, he was a very short guy. And they had a hard job taking him seriously, I think.
I've got a question that's been puzzling me for some time. As a sailor, the Waka rig appears to me to be rather satisfactory for going downwind, but not terribly satisfactory for going upwind. Can you tell us how close a Waka can sail to the wind?
I think I'll probably pass on that. I think I think that's a detailed question. I'm not the person to.
Around 70 degrees, down.
There actually have been, some of my colleagues, so people like Jeff Irwin, who are sailors and archaeologists at the same time. They've done a lot of, he's the guy that basically came up with this idea about sailing against the wind and then being able to, search and return, he calls it, as a strategy. And he's done quite a bit of testing, and so they do stuff in wind tunnels with the rigs, and they say that they can sail closer to the wind, against the wind than you might think, depending on the rig. But different island canoes have got different kind of rigs. And so, but what we do have is some of these sketches that I was showing. So it's one of the great things about having the artists on board the Endeavour, and then later on the Resolution as well, is that you've got all these images of these voyaging waka, and you can see the rig from those.
It's the images that's caused me to ask the question, because they are suggestive of better downwind sailing capability than upwind. But I have a follow-up question. Voyages of discovery suggest to me that people go out, find islands, and return with the news. Now, when New Zealand was discovered by the original voyagers, we're told it was a voyage of migration. A voyage of migration to a destination that you don't know seems to me to be strange. Now, if you're going to migrate, it seems that you know that there is a destination to go to. So do we know who discovered New Zealand from the Pacific people, and whether they got back to Tahiti, if Tahiti was the origin, with the news to cause the migration?
I think there's the need for knowing. Yeah, if you think of when you were describing I can give you an example, the whale migration paths. So lots of canoes, arai te uru, in other canoe traditions, it's a taniwha, so it's the whale. In our traditions, arai te uru is the canoe. We can have some traditions where the adze that carves the canoe is called kaupaki tua. Some of our traditions, the canoe is kaupaki tua. So there are all of these associations, like actors in a play. And in different plays, they play different roles. But the main thing is that they're all the same, they're connected to those traditions. So, does it really matter for us, I guess, would be the question, to go, we know in our traditions, the first canoe is Uruwa. It has all of these different details and traditions. And what's important is that Uruwa establishes us in our landscape. So as Ngāi Tahu, all of our place names, our connections, our whakapapa is embedded in this landscape through that canoe tradition and through the ancestor Rāsai Hautu who traversed the spine of our island and named everything. So in terms of that, probably the same again with our Polynesian relations, that we have the same traditions, the same canoes, the same figures, but the details are customised to each island. It is part of our cultural pattern. And I think of it like we have all those cultural connections, we put them in the suitcase, we take them to the new island and then we unpack them. And if you understand our culture, our people couldn't live in a profane landscape. It has to be tapu. So all of the mountains have a similar name, all of our peninsulas and rivers have similar names. But there are always, we customise, we have tuakana taina, older sibling, younger sibling. As I said before, we're the Ngāi Tahu are the descendants of Paikea, but we don't want to be the Ngāti Pro Binti. Yeah, we want to be here under our own mana, and so we customise all of those traditions. So in terms of the question you're asking, I don't think we can know the answer, but I think kind of the dynamics of it would be the answer to that question isn't as important as how do those canoe traditions support us to belong and to consecrate our landscape. Yeah, so that we're living in Eden, we're living in a sacred space. And that's the important thing, I think, for our people.
Good answer, Eru. Now, take another question. I'll take this one here.
Can I just chip in on that one though, because about a month, I suppose it was a couple of months ago now, they had a fantastic, what they call a voyaging wānanga up in the Bay of Islands, and was called by a trust that was working on one of the archaeological excavation of one of the earliest landing sites in the country. It's up in the Bay of Islands, and so what happened was that all the scientists that have been working on these issues, so the geneticists, the voyaging people that have been using their computer simulations, the ones that have been working with the rigs and things like that in the wind tunnels and looking at the hydrodynamics, got together with the tuanga, and people like Jack Thatcher were there, and it was the most amazing couple of days. It was fantastic. It was just great because the sort of expertise you need to answer that question was in that room, and you would have got about 5 or 6 different very expert converging opinions, because what they kept on finding was that and the scientists, the people that are working on this stuff now, I think, are very respectful of the traditional evidence that they are working with. They listen to it because increasingly they're finding that the science is telling them things which were already being claimed in the old accounts of multiple purposeful voyaging, for example, of people coming from different islands in short order. So Lisa says that the DNA that they found at Wairau Bar, for example, was very diverse. They didn't all just come from one place. There was a wide range of DNA lineages on board those waka that came down, and quite a few of them. And so it was an amazing session. You would have loved it, I think. If you're a sailor with a technical interest in these things, it was like being in Nirvana, because all the expertise was in the room, but it was converging. It was a real exchange, and that was the thing that I love about what's going on around the voyaging side of this, is that there's real respect there. From some of the best scientists in the world to some of the best voyaging practitioners, to some of the best traditional people knowledgeable in traditional knowledge. And it's not people being PC, it's people realising that their lines of understanding are converging as they do more and more research. And it was great to see it. It was a lot of fun. It was a marvellous journey.
I think too, even if you think of it as an example, maybe like people trying to find Hawaii, and to go, we try to seek the precision, where was the original departure point of the Māori migration? And you look at that, and for Māori, our worldview is based around whakapapa. So there are 17 Hawaii in New Zealand, so sometimes when we hear ancestor was in Hawaii and got upset with everyone and sailed for 5 days and arrived in Te Waiponamu, well, it's just an internal migration. But every island group has a Hawaii. It's the biggest island normally with a big sort of volcano-ish type peak. And it's called Savaii, Hawaii, Hawaii. And so, there are multiple Hawaiis, and when you understand again the sort of voyaging side, when you leave an island, there's nothing that is blue. You're sailing away from somewhere. And the easiest thing to see is the biggest volcano type peak in the island cluster. So Hawaii isn't just a homeland, it's a departure point. So every island has a Hawaii. And to go, well, which one's the real Hawaii? Well, they all are. And again, it's that thing of whakapapa that to go, well, probably our closest Hawaii would be in Rarotonga, and then moving into Hawaii and Tahiti, and then further and further. Savaii, they're all connected through whakapapa. But the main thing is that it is a real place. But it's also an idea of a homeland, an idea of and a practical departure point, where, in that first part of the journey of discovery, you don't know where you're going. So the first navigation marker is what you're leaving behind. And that's an idea of Hawaii as well. It was the place left behind in the journey.
Thank you. It's been so inspiring and such a wonderful talk today. I was curious, exactly the same point really. Banks wrote down that Tupaia had recorded a tsunami in New Zealand. And it's just mentioned very briefly in a book about Tupaia. There's some geological evidence of it as well. I'm just wondering if you know of any new science that's looking at that, or if there's any discussions because I'm really curious. I'd love to know more. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any evidence, because when I was, been working on this stuff, I've read all the logs because he got back home. And oh, I see. Oh, yeah. There are archaeologists who are working on this idea of a large tsunami. Yeah, there are. And archaeologists as well as geologists, geomorphologists. Well, I'm not an expert in that. I mean, I'm aware of the work that's going on. And tsunami were devastating to people that rely on the sea for transport, because all your waka would get wrecked. So, the coast and the impact on the coast, and a lot of people, again, was seagoing people. Mainly you're living on the coast and then along the river systems, the big river systems, and using them for transport too, because
it's so wonderful to be able to put heavy stuff on the waka instead of having to carry one back. You realise that life in Aotearoa, before Europeans arrived and before we became so land-based, I think this is something we should really think about actually when we think about the history of the deep history of our country. Most of it was a sea-based history. And you used to be able to get up a lot of the river systems by riverway. They're now clogged up with sediment. So you used to be able to come from Hokianga and get to Waimatere by river. You can't do that now. So many of our rivers that used to be navigable a long way up are now all choked. And so people use the rivers as highways. And so when did we become a land-based society? And what did we lose in the process?
Even like some of the early arrival traditions with the Uruwa canoe, it names and claims all of those inland mountain lakes. But a lot of those names are like Whakatepu Wai Māori, Lake Wakatipu, Whakatepu Wai Tai, Lake Kera, I think it is, Norte Whakatipu, the pass between the two, Awa Whakatipu, Hollyford Valley and River. So just that simple thing of even concentrating the landscape, but it's also connecting us with Painamu. And so Painamu flowed from the Dark River down across the lakes, down the Hollyford Valley, to a place where you can go there and you can see the very steep country where people would be felling trees pretty much straight into the lake and then trading them, sending them up north. Place names, and understanding that the flow of Painamu was determined by water and carried it large distances. But the maritime skill of crossing a bar on the west coast and sailing, that'd be something I wouldn't attempt today. But that they were ocean people and they had that skill, and that was the backbone of the Painamu trade, which can be found all throughout Aotearoa.
So maybe if you might,
Well, what can I say? Marie, you summed it up. What more fitting time to have this than in the year of Te Reo 250. And what's personally refreshing is to find, Diane, that you're not one of these revisionist historians who wants to write Cook out of the script. You're prepared to accept that the Tahitian explorers were every match for Cook in terms of their navigational skills. And I think that's an insight that we're all grateful to know. And the fact that Cook respected that and recognised that in 1769. And Eru, it's been wonderful to see a relaxed conversation like this on stage. I think our audience has been very quiet because they've been totally enthralled by the discourse. It truly was a great whananga. So thank you very much indeed. Cook was noted for exchanging gifts. He wanted food. The Maoris were curious to find out what muskets were. There's no food here, but these are Akaroa designed products, and we hope they'll fit in your suitcase, Dan, and in your car, Eru, and remind you of a very happy day that you've given us here. Finally, before we go to the supper room, because I know you'll be thirsting for a glass of meniscus wine and some delicious sandwiches, I just forgot, which is very remiss of me, to welcome Jeremy Salmond. Where are you, Jeremy? You must be in the room somewhere. Distinguished architect and Dayman's husband. Thank you for letting Dayman come down, and thank you for coming with us. And also, I forgot to mention that we're very privileged to have from Unuku Marae, Rick Kainui and his wife Angela.